welcome to episode 5 of the WolfCast, the MalWerewolf podcast. Today is Saturday, July 24th. I'm your host, Alan, aka Corgi Sec, joined as always by my co-host, Jason, aka Distracticon, and we are the team at MalWerewolf.com, here to talk all things cybersecurity. On this week's episode, we are taking a break from the recruitment series, and we'll discuss the security industry in Japan. Hope you enjoy it. How you doing, Jason?
I'm doing great. I'm doing wonderful. It's I was told it was going to rain here, and Phoenix and Scottsdale got all the rain, so I'm not wonderful. I'm actually really pissed, so I'm gonna keep it at that.
I mean, you should know it doesn't rain in Phoenix. It's all lies.
It was raining in Phoenix. Like there was trees on the ground, supposedly. I mean, this could all be a huge lie. Like, it could be a giant conspiracy.
Yeah, the big water is trying to, pull a fast one on you. But yeah, rain would be nice. I mean, it was too much sun here yesterday too, so went to the beach and now I look like a lobster. So there's that. But before we get further off topic, since we're talking security industry in Japan, we also brought back a guest from episode 2, John from also the Tokyo area. How you doing, John?
I'm good. I'm doing my best not to melt in the sweltering Tokyo heat, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But yeah, all good other than that.
Awesome. Well, at least we're inside recording the podcast. Otherwise, that would be a problem.
And at least the AC works. Otherwise, I'm just booking a ticket as far north as I can get.
I wonder, actually, what the temperature is in Hokkaido right now. Must be nicer than here. All right. I guess we should get going. So, as always, we'll lead with our news segment. And, so we got some pretty interesting stuff over the past few weeks. As usual, we're not going to spend too much time on it, but some of these stories are pretty interesting, so suggest you give them a go. Give them a read. And as always, we'll have all the links in the episode description. First story I have here is actually from forbiddenstories.org, and it's regarding the rise and fall of the NSO group. There's a number of these stories that came out over the past few weeks. This is regarding the Pegasus project, which essentially there's a group called the NSO Group out of Israel who sells surveillance software, if you want to put it in a diplomatic way, or you can say spyware if you want to be a bit more direct. And there was a big investigation by Amnesty International and the Forbidden Stories folks, and essentially, they linked their activity to a lot of, let's say, shady stuff. They were not very discriminate when it comes to who they sell their software to, and there were implications that Jamal Khashoggi, the journalist who was murdered, basically was a target. So was his family as well. This is one of the pieces of spyware that was basically delivered in order to keep tabs on him. So there's a bit of a track record of them selling it to, again, some not so friendly regimes as well. So not great PR on their part. So there's a lot. They're getting a lot of heat right now, and honestly, rightfully so, but at the same time, I don't think this is anything new. So I feel like this is going to be a fairly constant type of story.
Was there any conversation or anything within any of, I guess, the other news articles as well that linked them to actually like knowing what they were doing, or was this more and I say that simply because there's folks who buy things outside the scope of what a company would expect that person to be doing. As an example, was this something that they they knowingly knew who they were selling their services to.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Like they like, for example, they were selling it to the UAE for one thing, and like like one of the things this talks about is Israel actually kind of has a pretty much thing that says you're not allowed to go to the UAE as an Israeli citizen, but they made exceptions for these people in order to broker this deal. Um, and there's certain export controls on this type of software in Israel as well. However, that's another one of those things where they basically went through their quote-unquote vetting process and then just okayed it anyway. But yeah, UAE government is one of the ones they mentioned, but there's definitely others. Apparently, the Mexican government is a big customer of theirs as well. So it was used very much to target journalists and things like that. So
Gotcha.
they're kind of trying to claim like, oh, we don't know how they're going to use it once we sell it, and say that type of thing. But
malware developers say the same thing and no one cares. They're just like, yeah, we're still coming after you.
Yeah, pretty much. And it's also, I think, a little bit, honestly, I think in some cases the malware developers have a more valid excuse, because if they just code something, put it up on GitHub, and somebody misuses it, that's one thing. But in these people's cases, these were like, multi-million-dollar deals specifically around the software. And like the two out of the three people who founded it, they're business guys, but one of them is like an ex, intelligence dude. So he knew exactly what he was doing, like when they were making this. And something like they're, I think they're like an 800 per person company, and like 2/3 of that is R&D into basically just researching 0 days for mostly mobile. So like I don't think there's any pretense about like, oh, we don't know, that wasn't our intention. Our intention was, to help law enforcement. And that's kind of how they're coming at it. Like, oh no, we did this to stop crime. Like,
yeah, I think that's one of the things that I saw. Like a quote from them was basically like, "This is all slander, blah blah blah, or whatever," and we're just trying to do what we can to help people. Or God, I can't even remember what it was, but it was very more of like twisty positive.
Yeah, of course, because damage control. They're not going to go out and say like, no, yeah, we're selling it to whoever as long as they pay us. We don't care what they do with it. But, yeah, I mean, again, this is kind of a bit of deja vu with the hacking team, kind of the same thing, the Italian company. And actually, funny enough, there is a bit of a tie-up between these two companies, because the NSO group was kind of coming up when the hacking team was, still around and the main player in this particular space. And because of that hack of the hacking team, which took them out of business, the NSO group pretty much kind of just took over that market entirely. So yeah, not surprising, but not great. Hopefully, at least by having some attention on them, at least kind of people are aware. And I know at the very least there's Apple has taken this very seriously from the patching perspective and things like that. But yeah, they devote a lot of resources to finding flaws in mobile devices, essentially. And one of the things that made them different, apparently at first, was that they were focusing on zero-click exploits. So it pretty much required zero user interaction, and that's pretty valuable, because you don't, can basically just send a text message to somebody, and that's kind of the end of it. But yeah, it was an interesting read. I suggest people check it out. But yeah, this is not going to be the last of these stories. I feel like every few years, because there's a market for this, and as long as there's a market, there's going to be people trying to fill that.
Yep. So talking about zero click, that's pretty cool. So is the idea like, hey, we're able to execute from preview, Like, is the message pops up and it just automatically loads type of deal, or what are those delivery mechanisms?
I don't think it generally went in too much depth on what the actual exploits themselves are,
Yeah.
but they did basically say, like, yeah, usually it's just an SMS that you receive,
Okay.
and that's kind of enough.
Cool.
Which, yeah, I mean, that's pretty powerful, especially when it works on, things like iPhones as well, which people tend to assume are more secure. And even people in the know, you kind of generally assume you have to have some sort of interaction, like click a link or whatnot. So I can definitely see the selling point from the NSO side, but also the potential for misuse and abuse is absolutely massive, especially if you're not being um, very good about your vetting process, or if you just don't care,
Right.
which they're never going to come out and say that, but at the same time, I feel like the track record kind of speaks for itself in this particular case. And the next story is kind of following off of that from Vice.com, and basically Amazon AWS has shut down the NSO Group's infrastructure. So specifically, their accounts and infrastructure linked to the NSO Group have been shut down by AWS. And I think you're going to see more and more of that because people are obviously going to want to distance themselves from this. So any of these types of services, now that the story is out and about and gathering a lot of steam, I think you're gonna see more of that. I think, and honestly, that rightfully so. I don't think this is anything that's gonna end up putting him out of business by any means, but you're gonna see companies just stepping back just to not be pulled into the conversation of, hey, why are you supporting this type of activity? All right. And the next story from Threatpost is on the Kaseya, follow up on the Kaseya breach, and it seems like Kaseya obtains universal decryptor for the REvil ransomware. So it doesn't really go into much detail about how they actually did that. So it doesn't say whether they paid the ransom or not, but it did just say, okay, we got the universal decryptor from a third party, and that's now being passed out to the customers. My feeling here is, and this is obviously pure speculation, not based on anything, but they probably paid. Whether they paid the full amount or not, that's probably something we'll never find out, but I think the chance of just somebody randomly getting a hold of the decryptor is pretty low.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, good news, I suppose, in some ways. If they paid, that debate will go on about the pros and cons of that. And yeah, if you want to see an actual debate by a panel of people who talk about ransomware a lot, there's a Sans webcast on this very topic. So check that out. It's pretty interesting, and definitely makes you think about that conversation in a bit more depth versus just yes you should or yes you should, no you shouldn't. There's some very good arguments to be made for either side.
Yeah, absolutely. There's never going to be at least personally, I don't think there's ever going to be a clear-cut winner. You can say there's advantages to either side, but there's always going to be a reasons to or to not pay.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a debate that's going to keep going on for a long time. Basically, as long as ransomware is around, I don't see that going away. And
well, I've got a debate for you, Alan. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? And let's spend 2 hours today talking about it, and then do that for an hour every week.
Well, I'm going to say chicken basically because I like eating chicken meat, so I'm biased towards the chicken, so I'll say chicken. See? 2-minute debate. Not even that. We solved it. They just need to get us on every debate and we'll win.
I don't understand what just happened here, but okay. Keep going.
See, that's how you win debates, is you just confuse the hell out of the other person. So they give up.
Okay. All right, you're the winner. I'll concede.
All right, keeping on topic. Following up from that, apparently one of the things that was interesting after, not too long after the Kaseya thing went live, the Revol ransomware site actually went offline, and this was their Tor site, the blog where they kind of post about the victims and all that stuff. And weirdly enough, kind of similar thing like the dark side people after the Colonial Pipeline. So yeah, they just kind of disappeared. I haven't seen if they came back up or not, but there could be a lot of explanation for this. It could just be, hey, they got a payoff and they decided to lay low. It could be, okay, again, we drew too much heat and Papa Putin is not happy, so he had some words. But
I mean, in most cases, I would imagine it's kind of like stealing from a bank. And the more frequent that you steal from banks, it's going to be more and more likely, statistically, that you're going to get caught, right? If you do it once,
sure,
ever, you'll never get caught. Well, I mean, you could still get caught, but the reason to try and track that one person is just kind of diminishes over time. But like in this specific case, I wonder if you're kind of curious if you're right, if this is just all right, time to lay low for a year or two, and we still have our implants in many different places, and we're waiting before XYZ happens, and our name starts kind of going down a little bit.
Yeah, and there's some theories to that as well. A lot of these groups, what they will do is, when they get to the public eye to a certain degree, they will lay low or, quote unquote, rebrand, lay low for a bit, come back, either under a different name or change their TTPs a little bit. Obviously, too early to know whether that's the case here, but just like with the Colonial Pipeline thing, I mean, that's a lot of heat. You're getting a lot of attention on you, so you probably kind of want to disappear. Because, I mean, at that point, you've already... You have a lot of heat on you anyway, so I feel like they are squarely on, FBI's radar. But... Yeah. Whether that leads to something or not, we're not going to know probably for a while, but it's, from their perspective, I completely understand why they would want to go ahead and lay low if that's what actually happened.
Yeah.
But it's also just as likely that, you hit the wrong target and all of a sudden that immunity you have because you're operating out of Russia goes away because, at a certain point, if there's enough international pressure, they might just kind of hand you over as let's appease the people for a bit.
Yeah.
So, we're not in a position to know yet. There's not enough details, but I'm curious to see whether, considering how active they've been, whether this is kind of the end of their activity, at least for a little while. And if they considering they asked for a 17 million payout, and I think that last I read was negotiated down to maybe about 50. And who knows, it might have gone even lower than that if they actually paid. But still, that's even if you get 20 million out of that, that's a pretty decent payoff. You probably don't need to keep going. So yeah, we'll see. I'm interested to see how that goes. All right, and next story kind of is keeping along that some of the same track, and this is from the Hacker News, and it's U.S. and global allies accuse China of massive Microsoft Exchange attack. So the attack on Exchange that happened not too long ago. Yeah, apparently APT-40 was behind that, which is a Chinese APT group. And there's been a statement issued basically by the White House saying that, with a high degree of confidence that they were associated with the PRC, which is the Chinese military. And this was essentially accusation from U.S. and a number of allies, including the UN, the UK, and NATO. So that feels like that's a lot of attribution. So probably that is a fairly accurate. That's a fairly accurate assumption there.
Right. Interesting.
Yep. Well, as very predictably, China went ahead and said no, it wasn't
Denied
us.
it completely.
Oh, of course, because why wouldn't they? All right, and the last story for this week, a bit topical. It's from Bleeping Computer, and the FBI is basically saying that threat actors may be targeting the 2020 Tokyo Summer Olympics. Not much details here. They're just basically saying that potentially they might be targeting the Olympic Games, which there's no evidence of it, but yeah, I feel like that's a fairly safe assumption to make. I feel like the previous Olympics have been targeted, so it really wouldn't be a surprise if these are as well. And to me, that was...
This is going to sound mean, but this kind of felt like this just in, clouds in the sky means there could be rain at some point.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, the fact that there's no real actual data to, say like, hey, we're seeing evidence of an attack or anything, like it's, not much to go in. It's just like, hey, we think this is going to happen, which, yeah, sure. Are there people who are potentially interested in targeting the Olympics? I'm sure there are. So
Yeah.
whether it's actually going to happen or not, I guess we'll wait and see, given that they just started. So
Sure. It does say it's already being used as fishing and fishing lures.
yeah, I mean, that'll happen around any major events. It's just these groups are just looking for a
COVID.
reason to...
Look how quickly that took over. Hey, are you working from home? Click here to make sure you're secure real quick. And just, oh, goodness gracious. Get your vaccine. Yeah. Click on this link.
Yeah, pretty much. I mean, I will be very interested. I mean, one of the things I've said for a very long time, and this is kind of on topic with what we're going to talk about in regards to Japan later, that I feel like for Japan to wake up when it comes to security and really take a step forward, it's going to take something like very big to happen, something very public, something very... that kind of gets the international eye on Japan. And Olympics was kind of the thing that I speculated would be that. Obviously this was before COVID, so it's a little bit different, but
again, something that you're going to get into, but this has already happened, right? Like North Korea just kind of went nuts against all of the Japanese banks as well as against Sony. So it's apparent that there's a lot of targeting happening, but at what scale does it finally become a complete change in direction as to changing the way security happens in that side of the world?
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, though. Whether it'll cause any meaningful change or not, that's... the jury is always kind of out on that. But at some point, you kind of just feel like that something has to. And I feel like for the rest of the world, like, it's kind of been the same thing. Like that there's been a series of big breaches, and in cases now, ransomware is causing folks to take a lot more notice. But yeah, I feel like Japan's still waiting on whatever that is. And something like this that's very public and could be very embarrassing, and for the country as a whole. Could be that thing here. Whether it actually would, whether it will, jury is still out.
I'm waiting for them to show up and there's just no water in any of the pools, and someone goes, "Oh, it was ransomware." Oh, even better, they say the water ran somewhere.
Oh. All right, well, that was a good, I guess we'll just end the news segment there, and I think that leads us into our first break, and after we'll come back and get into our main topic. So we'll be right back. And welcome back. All right, so as we mentioned before, let's get into our main topic, security in Japan. So, couple of reasons we wanted to cover this particular topic. I know me personally, over the years, I've gotten questions through places like Reddit, etc., about people seeing that I was planning to move, because I actually posted about this stuff before coming here. And they were just asking things like, "Hey, I'm kind of interested in doing the same thing. I'm in the security industry. How did that work out for you?" And just wanting to know kind of what happened with that. And I figured this might be something interesting for folks to discuss and talk about. So got a decent amount of stuff to cover, so let's get into that. And first, just kind of want to start off with a very high-level industry overview, and we'll go from there. And Jason, in your case, since obviously you're not in Japan, I think one thing it'd be interesting to know is just whether, my perception about some of these things that I see as potentially Japan-specific are actually just general industry trends, maybe in the States as well, just because I haven't been back to the States in like 6 years. Also, saying that out loud, that makes me feel old.
Well, I'm gonna have to check with the wife, because I didn't realize I wasn't in Japan. Like, this was news to me. What?
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, like, why aren't you? Like, you should be. I know your wife would not have any objections.
Yeah, well, probably not. No objections on all the sushi, but
there's a lot of sushi.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a whole bunch. Knife goes in, guts come out.
Oh, great! You made sushi completely unappetizing now.
Hey, Simpsons makes all things appetizing. I don't even know what I'm saying. Go.
All right. So John, feel free to jump in. But I just wanted to start off with a broad overview, and essentially, the thing here is the industry is very small. I think that's kind of the best place to start. Is the industry in general? I think the security industry is not very large. Even worldwide, we're a relatively new industry, in the grand scheme of things, and constantly you're kind of getting that sense of just how tight-knit of a community it actually is. But in Japan, like, that is really, really very much the case, because there's just, for a number of different reasons, the industry here is fairly new. There's not much of a local market. Just the focus when it comes to IT stuff is not really focused on security. So it really is like a very, very tiny industry here. I feel like at some point I've probably interacted with the majority of people who work in dedicated security roles at least in the Tokyo area.
I would imagine that happens extremely quick, considering even over here, I can go to SplunkConf, which is like across the world, and still know like probably at least 40 people. It'd be like, "Hey, I talked to you before. And I'm like, "Oh golly, this is scary." Like I'm worried that some random person knows me online, let alone knowing and meeting someone that I've had conversations with before. I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, you constantly get a feel for how small this industry is, like you said, yeah, anywhere, but here it's, yeah, it really feels like you really feel it. And even though, you know, it is growing, I don't think it's definitely, like, I don't think it's growing at the speed that it is in some other places. I mean, has that kind of been your take on that as well, John, from what you've seen? I mean, you've kind of been here as long as I have.
Yeah, I mean, I've been here. I've only been working in security a little over 2 years, but it's certainly a small town. There's no question about that. I mean, if you scroll through LinkedIn profiles, or you follow up leads in companies that are hiring, there's a reasonable chance that you're going to see people that you know, people that you've met, or your paths have crossed for whatever reason, right, have worked there or are working there presently. And I obviously can't comment on just how tight-knit of a community it is back home, but out here, yeah, you feel like you're running into the same handful of people kind of being shuffled around between the same handful of companies. And I think it is growing, but it's growing at a pretty slow pace, I would say. It still feels like the community hasn't appreciably grown that much since I got here, and a lot of that is COVID, I'm sure, but it definitely feels very, 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 very small.
Yeah. Uh, and actually, that leads us into the next thing I want to talk about is a little bit about, so what has changed between the first time I moved here and now. And, there has definitely been change. When I was initially kind of trying to find work in my industry when I got here, there really was not much. There's very few things, even with a decent amount of experience. So I feel like that's gotten a little bit better. For what reason exactly, I'm not entirely sure. I don't know whether that's just COVID and shift from to working from home, or maybe some of these high profile attacks and things like ransomware, etc., that get some more mainstream visibility. It is different. It is, I think, moving a little bit in the right direction, but it is still very, very, not a major shift.
Yeah, so I know from at least from the past 6 years for us, get it because I said us, but it actually is like the U.S. But one of the big changes is the shift from, well, I shouldn't say the big change. Like, people are just kind of getting around to it, but really that focal point of that next gen SOC, that the big old buzzwords were happening a couple years back. But I would say probably around that 5 year ago mark was when that was really being starting to be considered and looked at by some of the bigger companies, and that's finally kind of moving down into some of the smaller ones. But that's also when the concepts of automation and orchestration really started playing out. So from our perspective, where we were and what we were doing, also I would say things like zero trust and just multi-factor authentication, those things really were getting their start back then. You could say that it's been happening for X amount of years, but I would say that like 2014, 2015 year was really when we started seeing folks adopt it a little bit more regularly, especially from the bigger companies.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the weird thing. It's like, you talk about a lot of those things that are relatively, I guess, new and kind of quote unquote, let's say advanced, I guess, in terms of something like moving to a zero trust model or something like that. Like, Japan is not there. Japan is very much like focused on compliance. Like that security, that's kind of what it is. That's like one of the things I said when I first got here was like this industry is like 10, 15 years behind the rest of the world. And the reason I said that is because like I feel like back in like the early 2000s is when maybe the US was kind of in the same boat where the focus was a lot on okay, well, we need to make sure that, from the auditing perspective, we're covered and we're compliant and this and that. And that's kind of where the focus was. And that's sort of where Japan, for the most part, is still. Yeah, there is some changes to that. I mean, I'm seeing more shifting towards things like actually SOCs being a thing, like people using managed security services and having dedicated security roles coming up more than I used to see them. But it's still not, I think, very few companies here, they have like an established SOC, for an example. Like that's still...
Is that a direct reflection to the fact that there's not talent? Or is it just because companies don't find it important, or is it really just a combination of both?
I mean, I feel like it's a combination of different factors. I think on one hand, there isn't the talent. On the other hand, a lot of the people basically running these companies, that they have been running them for a long time, they're not necessarily people who have, let's say, focused on things like security or IT very much. They're maybe not well versed into the risks that kind of brings. And Japan also tends to be very risk averse, very averse to change. Like they tend to really not like change, and obviously changing from the old way of working as a kind of a more traditional style company into, quote unquote, the digital transformation, and then having to worry about security and all of that. It's a hard sell for a lot of companies. Like trying to show them the value of that is difficult. And also on top of that, like when I've talked to people about things like, APT this, APT that, like there's just a lot of people who are not even aware that that's a thing. Like you talk about, no, there's nation states and they're hacking each other. Like the answer I get back is like no, like that, people don't do that. Like why would you?
Espionage hasn't been a thing for like since the start of any kind of country or nation or what?
Yeah.
I mean, I've run into the perception, and I'm not going to insinuate that this is widespread, right? It's just one anecdote, but you will run into people who work not in security specifically, but people who work within IT more broadly, and ought to have had some exposure to the concept, but some people don't even recognize security as a legitimate discipline in its own right. There's a perception that I think some people have that it shouldn't be needed, right? If a company's running properly, software is designed and developed properly, there should be no need for dedicated security staff, right? There's no appreciation of the depth of the problem or the depth of the risk you're exposing yourself to, because I think it's not something that's publicized very widely here. I don't, my Japanese isn't quite good enough that I can be consuming Japanese language news on a regular basis, but I don't think that it's something that's as widely recognized or has the sort of public recognition that it would in the United States.
Yeah, I saw tweets on Twitter and messages on LinkedIn over the past week. I want to say literally a day after Alan was commenting to me just through one of our casual conversations of like, yeah, somebody mentioned something about security not really being needed. And then it just became this thing where because I heard about it and I heard Alan say it, I guess maybe my focal point was, I'm going to be more perceptive of people saying these things. And yeah, it was going all over the place, seeing people say, oh, people just need to learn how to code properly, and then we won't need security. It goes, okay.
But that's the thing, right? Like, people who are maybe not in the industry, maybe they see security as a code problem to solve, as a software development challenge, which that's a part of it, but I feel like that ignores like 2/3 of that of the industry. Like, coding is one thing, misconfiguration.
How's that stop phishing?
Yeah, exactly. Like, misconfiguration is another thing. Like, you can code things properly, but you can still have whoever is implementing it misconfigure things, and you're basically still in the same boat. That's still a vulnerability. You can also, and like you said, social engineering. Like, that's been a part of security since its inception. Like, there's a reason Kevin Mitnick made a name for himself the way he did. And that's not a problem that you solve by, a secure development lifecycle or something, like, but that's, again, the issue. It's the fact that these types of people making those comments, they don't understand the industry to that level, so they just see it as, well, for a hacker to exploit something, there needs to be a vulnerability, and as long as there's no vulnerabilities, then there's no hackers, which means there's no need for security, which, even if we were to say, okay, fine, let's say it's 100% a coding challenge, that's like the idea of fixing that to the extent that it becomes non-existent issue is, like, it's impossible. Like, that will never happen.
Well, I mean, that's the whole entire concept of things like law bins, right? You're using legitimate things that may not even have an exploit associated to them, and you're able to use them for your potential nefarious purpose, your intent. So if you're PS execing to a box that is openly available, is that a security flaw from the perspective of any kind of application? No, it's potentially a, hey, you probably shouldn't have had a public IP exposed and PS exec available for someone to access. But those are the things that just are not accounted for this stuff. Everyone hears security, and quite frankly, I was told this before I moved out here. I was told when I was mentioning I was moving over to this to Arizona, because I knew this guy who was moving towards the security field, and it sounds super cool and all that. And the stuff I got back from the IT person I knew at the time was, well, just be careful, because security is going to be done within the next few years because no one's going to care about it. And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll take my chance on it.
Well, it's too bad that he was right and we're both jobless now.
Sure.
And, we don't have a podcast about security either, so it's clearly like we have no audience.
I mean,
that's for a different reason,
Yeah. Yeah. I'm not going to sit here and be like, oh yeah, we got a whole lot of people listening when we don't. But like,
hey, those 3 people that do,
yeah,
they're way into it.
We're getting there. We're getting there, and hopefully, people will be so tired, so exhausted about hearing us talk, kind of like Kanye West, that then they'll just have to tell everybody else to like share in their misery, and yeah, we'll all. I don't know. Well,
why'd you have to bring his name into it? Now we're gonna get like a takedown notice or something. But yeah, I mean, I don't think that type of mindset, unfortunately, is rare even now, but I think that's definitely one of the things that's not helping the perception of the industry here. But just to kind of go back very briefly to that same point, is like saying like, oh, the fix is just everybody on the planet that touches a piece of code or creates anything has to just make sure to do it perfectly so there's no flaws. Like, when you actually say that sentence out loud, it sounds kind of ridiculous, because I just think that's an impossible task anyway. So even if that was the only problem to solve, I don't think that's a task we're going to solve for God knows how long, if ever.
Right. There's some efforts, right? Some
Sure.
of the things that I've heard, which have been super cool. I really like the idea. One of the ladies at the Diana Initiative from last week, which was a conference taking place that focuses on like diversity within the field, but Tanya was talking about security champions and building that, instilling it into positions, and it's things that a lot of companies they've done at a small scale of like, oh, let's see if we can find one person. But she was talking about reinforcing it, making sure that you keep moving forward with it, and making it so that there's a representation on every single team. Just to have one person that's at least security focused on the mindset. But it still always falls back, and the thing she was also saying was that it always falls back to this issue where people will kind of get lazy on it or forget about it, or there'll just be not a lot of chatter about it over the course of time, and then it's forgotten. So I do like the idea of trying to help bring folks up and help them grow from that side of things. The other thing was gone out of my head, so I'll have to remember later.
Well, we can always get back to it. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely things we can do better. I mean, we talked in the last episode, about things like education. It's part of that education could be, part of your software engineering or whatever, based education should be the idea of coding securely, and so basically you're kind of learning that concept early on, because once you're in the job, maybe you've already developed some of these habits, and maybe they become harder to change. So there's definitely places we can do better with that, but it's like, saying it and actually solving it, those are very, very different different things. So like, it's like saying, well, social engineering wouldn't work if we just educate all of our users.
Yeah, user education in of itself is a huge question mark, and like how we approach it, because I'm not totally of the opinion that forced user education will actually provide solid change. Like it will provide change, but the more steps you add to things, the more frustrated folks will get, and if they do not have interest, or they don't have a reflected interest in those security aspects, they're either going to leave or find ways around it. I mean, how many times did we find folks looking for programs or whatever to get around potential security things because they wanted to watch something online, as an example. So a lot of the stuff that I like to focus on is more about let people do things, to try and find ways to educate them, and more be that slow subconscious change, but also build enough things in place to stop the bad things from happening. So as an example, maybe you can do something where you figure out ways to identify malicious clicks, right, in a phishing email, instead of sitting there and trying to build a whole bunch of stuff around that. Maybe you just provide a notice to the user saying, hey, we noticed that you clicked on something. Or maybe they ran something. Maybe they ran some software that they're not sure of. Is there a means to provide a custom message that says, hey, we're just letting you know this was blocked because of this. Are they going to read it? I don't know. But the gradual understanding always tends to be a better means for change than trying to do something that is very, very aggressive.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's it's a problem to solve, definitely, because trying to force it down people's throats, it doesn't work. Like, if it just becomes a thing that they have to, just, hey, I need to do this because I'm being badgered into doing it, and I have a course to be compliant, and that's honestly, like, user education is a whole topic in itself that I'm sure we'll cover at some point, because definitely it's something that we could be doing better, and it's very few places that I've seen do it effectively.
Sure. Well, how is it in Japan right now? Like, is there any user education at all from your perspective?
The most I've ever seen is just like, okay, we're having a fishing drill. Here you go. That's it. Like, there is stuff like that, but the thing is, I how effective that is, I don't really know. I feel like, especially in bigger companies, like, none of this stuff is being tailored necessarily to the specific region or the group of people you're targeting, for example, which is part of the problem itself. Like, Japan is culturally very, very different than the rest of the world, so I feel like the way that they take in information and interpret it, the way they approach things, is going to be different than if you are targeting your employees in the US. So I feel like, from the user education standpoint as well, you need to kind of take that into account, and most companies generally they don't, because that's a lot more effort versus just having a global program, for example. So that's a part of it. All right, so let's get into the next part here, and I want to talk specifically about, for people interested in moving to Japan, and what that experience was like for me, and obviously from the perspective of getting into the industry here. So one thing I will say, the ideal situation here, if you're looking to do that, would be to find a job in the country you're in, and see if that company has a presence in Japan, and then move through them if at all possible, because that way you're moving with an actual job. However, that is definitely easier said than done. I mean, I tried to do that. The company I was with at the time did not have a presence in Japan, and applying directly while not being here is something that at least was not the case. I was not having any luck with. Maybe not that's different, because a lot of it is shifting towards Zoom and whatever because of the pandemic. So maybe now that's a little bit more acceptable. But definitely at the time when I was looking, that was not something that was very fruitful. So
I'm
it's
also curious just how more willing are people going to be for the right candidate to say, yeah, this is remote. We're going to let remote mean remote, and let you kind of go wherever you want.
Yeah, I mean, here, that's part of the problem, right? Is that the whole concept of remote work is something that is, like, almost non-existent here, before the pandemic especially. I mean, I think even with the pandemic, the adoption of remote work was something like 30%, where the government target was 70%. So, yeah, even during the pandemic, that's a hard sell, and I do think it's gonna be something that you're gonna definitely see a lot more going forward. But whether that's gonna stay, whether that's gonna be something that survives the post-pandemic times, I'm fairly skeptical, just because the culture here is about, you need to be in the office. You need to be working from there for the most part. That your manager needs to have eyes on you, and I will say this is mostly for the traditionally Japanese culture type companies. So whether they change or not, I think that's going to be a tough sell. But I definitely have noticed that there's a lot more people who are saying, like, hey, this remote thing is kind of nice. I don't want to go back to the office. So
what a shocker. Well,
yeah.
I know one of the things that we talked about before as well was the fact that we're kind of going through a really weird situation over here where there's a want to try and drive people back to the office. Not a need. There's a want. Some things, sure, is a need, but from the security perspective, I haven't seen a whole lot of valid reasons of needs, instead of it just being something where it's more of a personal preference. Like, do you want to work in an office? Okay, yeah, go ahead. But I'm seeing a lot of jobs shift over to Austin, Texas, or just in Texas in general. And I've directly known folks who have been hired prior with the concept that, oh, this is going to be remote, and then being told it's likely going to stay remote, likely being the key. And then all of a sudden, oh, we're starting to get the okay to open up, and being told, guess you have to move to Texas, and people don't want to. So there's going to be interesting repercussions for all of that in pretty much everywhere.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I was very surprised to see some of these big tech companies like Google basically requiring a very large percentage of their workforce to be back in the office. Yeah, I don't, I'm sure they have their reasons. I know there was a big protest against Apple, basically. Their employees were very not happy about needing to go back to the office. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like the way forward is kind of work anywhere. Like you mentioned, is give people the option. At this point, if you are able to support all those models of working, it's only gonna do you a favor in the long term in the market when you're competing, because you're all of a sudden not going to be the guy that says, no, you have to be in the office, when maybe other people are going to say, well, you work however you want.
I think there's a lot of stuff that I don't know. Like, I don't know or totally understand the trying to determine body count in an office, as an example, having to justify those costs, having to determine what does growth look like, and what is the future output in comparison to what that growth should suggest in people, to us doing something like buying a new building. But so I'm kind of at that point where I totally understand if that stuff is presented in that fashion and explained in that fashion. A lot of stuff that I've heard from managers has been, those conversations shouldn't have to get to people. And I don't agree with that. Like, if that is actually what is causing some of those problems and concerns, then let it get to the people. Let them get understanding of some of it, as far as like figuring out growth, being able to, because right now you're basically just telling people, well, we know how to make you most productive, even though most of the companies that I know of that are actually with security teams have had record profits over the past year with remote workers. So how do you justify it? Like, when you try and pitch that and then say, no, we found that you're more productive while you're in office, and then say something like, oh no, well, we had a great quarter. Like, how exactly does that reflect to you? It reflects ignorance. That's all it really does. So it's better to come out and say, like, hey, we had a really good quarter, but what we're trying to explain is that the reason why the productivity was increased was because this is reflective of our years that we were still in the office. We don't have the numbers yet to reflect what actually associates to work from home life. Now, if you had that kind of data to show and prove, that means that you trust your people, and you see that you let them understand it for themselves, instead of just coming out and saying, like, yeah, you're going to be more productive. But
yeah, I mean, transparency on that stuff obviously is only gonna help people understand it, because when you're not giving any of that context, then all you're basically doing is letting people create their own reasons as to why things are that way. But kind of tying that back to Japan, like Japan has a very Tokyo especially, I guess, has a very good reason why they should be embracing work from home. And both John and I have had to work in the office before my previous job anyway. And transportation, like Tokyo is a city of 30 plus million people. Like they have some of the best public transportation on the planet, but during rush hour, like this is like it's a nightmare. Like especially if you're in some of the busier lines, like you're packed in a train like a sardine, and like it's not a good experience when you're having to do that twice a day, or commute maybe 90 minutes to work in one direction. Like they have a very good reason. Like if 30% of the Japan, or Tokyo at least, adapted work from home, relieving that congestion on the public transportation, would be a massive thing for them.
I took the BART twice in San Francisco, and I remember thinking at that time, I don't envy Alan, and I know there's no way, shape, or form it was anywhere close to what you folks deal with, because like I could sit down and there was other open spots next to me because I don't like being around people. So if I sat down and there was a person just like rolling right up next to me, or if I had to stand right next to someone, I'd be yelling at them the whole entire day, like, "Don't touch me, get away!"
Yeah, I mean, just to jump in with my perspective, what I've seen working here. I mean, I think everything you guys have said is accurate. I'm a big proponent of work from home myself, and I think in a place as densely populated as Japan, there would be a lot of pluses to it. It's just the culture, the work culture here being what it is. I think that outside of a handful of international, very, open-minded companies, I don't really see it being something that lasts in the long term. I think already a lot of companies, based anecdotally on what I've heard and seen in the past year or so, a lot of companies have already pushed to go back to the office, and I'm sure employees are not happy about it, but this is not really a culture where, airing those grievances to management is something that people tend to do. Thing that's, I think, a driving force in everything about Japan's business culture is that it's all centered around seniority.
Holy
right?
cow! Jeez. That's a wonderful topic that we need to bring up too. Keep going. Sorry.
I don't know. Are we getting ahead of ourselves?
No. I mean,
no.
yeah, there's that the whole concept of seniority and stuff like that. Yeah, again, there's a debate to be had.
I that's actually something I didn't even think about or consider, because Alan knows me, and all the people that have worked with me know me. I'm very open. I will say things I probably shouldn't say in open forums, whether it be chat rooms or whether it be directly on calls with CISOs on there. But mostly because I feel like that passion, that interest that I have, if I stunt it and I get really worried about what I say in front of these folks, I'm going to fall into the spiral of I'm just going to sit in color type of mentality and not provide any perspective. So I try, and I've been blessed enough to be around people who just let me be me and understand how to extract that data and do something cool with it. So like me going over to Japan, where it's about seniority, it's about like how long you've spent somewhere, or what status you are in something. I don't even know how I would get through any job for longer than like a few weeks. That's insane.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very specific reason that most of my employers that I've been with in Japan have been international companies. And it's for that same reason. Like, we're kind of very similar in that sense. Like, we're very outspoken. We're very, if there's an issue, we'll bring it up. It's not going to be just complaining to complain. Like, we'll give you a solution as well. But, like, I have a very hard time sitting there noticing a problem and then just being quiet about it. And that's just something you don't do here. Like, at least in the more kind of like culturally, it's just it's just not a thing. It's and the more kind of traditional the company is, the more that tends to be the case. So for me personally, I know I'm not gonna fit in that type of environment, which is why I tend to be very selective about where I go when looking for work here. And that's something that I think people coming here, if you are that similar type of personality, you need to kind of understand what you're getting into. So if you are somebody who's kind of outspoken, who's very direct and things like that, you're going to either need to find a company here that is more westernized or kind of more international and is okay with that, or you're going to kind of have to change the way you are to suit the culture here, because that's just not it's really not gonna do you any favors in the long run.
I mean, another anecdote I'll share just to maybe put it in perspective for listeners. This is something I've heard and not observed because I've never worked in a very domestic or traditional company, but one thing that is known to happen is quite often you'll have people in high-level positions who are very old school to the point that they don't use computers or interact with computers in any capacity. Email is still used, but apparently it's not unheard of for staff to be printing out the emails and then hand delivering them to some of the senior managers because they just don't want to be bothered with this kind of newfangled technology. I don't know how common or widespread that is, right? But just the general sense I get of how old school management can be at some domestic companies here, some old-fashioned companies. I don't think it's actually that far from what you might run into in that kind of environment. So when you're talking about working from home, right, and holding meetings over Zoom, you're kicking it up to an extra level of newfangled technology you're introducing there. So just the uphill battle you'd be fighting there, I think, would be a pretty steep one.
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a very quick example to let you understand that, and it's Japan still very actively uses fax machines. So yeah, think about that for a second.
What do you think is going to happen? Because I don't know if you folks saw this, but one of the more recent mentions from Microsoft actually is to push people away from email and to utilize Teams as total scope communications, literally for everything. So that's what the push is. And if not for anything, Microsoft does pretty well with like staying on that project plan. I mean, like there at one point, I don't know again if anyone's seen it, but there was like an Xbox project lifecycle thing that detailed out like something crazy. It was like 15 years, and literally every single year that I saw on there matched with what they were doing and what they were targeting, how they were targeting it, up to even the point of like, yeah, we're going to try and get into the TV sector and build that into our Xbox. And sure enough, that's what they did. But like, I can only imagine the panic going through the senior assistant administrator's head when they're sitting there trying to like print out each reply to each thread, which is then printing out like full pages every single time of like, oh, this person said this person said this, and it's just completely changed.
Yeah, I don't see that happening anytime soon. So the way that would end up happening here is everybody else will be on something else, and then Japan will still be doing the thing they've been doing. Like the only time you see things really taking a step forward is with some of these new companies that are trying to kind of be more modern, and that kind of does go back to the recruitment aspect. So here, when looking for work, recruiters are a very big thing. Like almost every job I've gotten here, you have to kind of go through a recruiter who specializes in whatever your field is. There's a lot of IT recruiters here, and for the most part, you're going to be working through them, just because they do a lot of that pre-filtering and things like that, and companies will go to them. I know obviously recruiting is not exactly something specific to Japan, but it's almost exclusively, like if you're somebody coming from abroad looking to work in the IT industry, like you're kind of going through them, for a number of different reasons, including, just some of that negotiation, the things like there's the language filtering aspect of that. What is your level of Japanese, and you want to generally talk to somebody in English maybe to make the process a little bit easier, and help you find that placement. But you're kind of really having to rely on them fairly heavily, and that's always going to be a mixed bag because you're entirely at the mercy of how good is the recruiter you're working with, and that becomes a thing you really have to learn how to spot, because a lot of the times they have very aggressive sales quotas, and they'll try very, very hard to convince you to take whatever is on the table. Whether that's a good fit for you or not, it doesn't matter to all of them. It's just about getting that sale, and it's about how many people you place. It's not about what the salary and things are, that you place them into. So that's something also you need to kind of be careful of, and you need to understand to recognize, because like one thing I talked about before, that was kind of a big thing for me, is I came here and I took a fairly significant pay cut to get the job I got, and I would tell the recruiter at that point, like, this is what I want, this is the type of job, and I had a handful of them basically tell me, no, it's still too high, you have to go lower, because that's what they were finding. And I got to the point where I basically had to say, this is the bare minimum I'm willing to take. Either you find me a job that fits, or don't bother calling me. Like, I am not going to lower any lower than that. And if that's not something you can find, then okay, I'll talk. I guess I'll wait to talk to somebody who can. But that happens quite frequently.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it's something to again be aware of. I've gotten jobs with recruiters in the States as well, but applying directly is fairly common too. Here, I've almost never applied directly to the company for anything. So
I mean, I've done that a few times here. It is possible. A lot of companies still do use major job boards, so it can be done. I have gotten responses doing that as well, but typically the majority of it, I would say, goes through recruiters. Sometimes recruiters will have access to openings that you might not be able to find on your own. And Alan, we were just talking about this the other day. You see a lot of these phantom listings where, it's like a blind dating service. They'll just give you a general description of the company, but they don't want to tell you the name until you've actually contacted them and you are ready to start the interview process. So yeah, I mean, I haven't done enough searching in the States to compare, but I also get the sense it's more centered around using recruiters and agencies.
The whole phantom company concept. There's fucking dog. I'm gonna have to remove this part.
Profanity filter activated.
Yeah, we're waiting for them to stop. All right. So the phantom company perspective of things, that's actually super duper common still here. I have to do quite a bit when I'm having those conversations with recruiters, to either get like a concept as to what I'm dealing with in general, or getting the actual name of the company. And I don't actually know if that's the headhunter's reasonings. Like I don't know if that's their it's a policy on them, or if it's the companies telling the headhunters that we don't want them, we don't want you naming us specifically until we are moving forward with an actual interview.
I mean, it's a weird one.
Yeah.
Because, like, I have cases literally, like, as recently as last week where a company I've already applied to directly, I've gotten that type of thing from a recruiter without naming him, when clearly looking at what they're talking about, it is that exact posting. So, like, they already have a public, essentially, job out there, but these recruiters are still doing that. So, like, it really is a pet peeve of mine, because it's like, why do I need to reply to you just to basically go, what is the company? Because I'm never going to accept an interview if I don't know who is it for. So it just seems, to me, it's just wasting everybody's time.
And also, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but I know, Alan, this has happened to you. It's happened to me as well. There are certain companies out in Japan that are just, notorious for being extremely tough places to work, and basically treating their staff terribly. So recruiters will be aware of this, but oftentimes when they're concealing the name of the company, it's because it's one of those companies with a bad reputation. And I've had that happen to me, where a recruiter's trying to kind of reel me in with JD that sounds promising until they have to reveal the name of the company, and then quickly lose interest. Alan, I know it's happened to you as well.
That makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. But that's, again, one of those things where eventually you're going to have to disclose that information, because I'm not going to take an interview that's like, who am I interviewing? I don't know. What's the company? I don't know. Like, that's a waste of my time.
I was going to say, that kind of sounds like some of the hiring scams that we've had to deal with, where people just kind of say, "Oh yeah, don't worry, you're definitely going to get an interview. Pay us $500 and we'll help set it up for you." And then they pay the $500 and never hear from the person again.
Yeah, it's not great.
Don't worry, application security will fix that too.
100%. We'll be there by next year. So, one other thing I want to mention here is contracting versus permanent roles. There's a lot of companies in Japan that are very heavy into contract roles. Not only for foreign labor necessarily, but even just, for Japanese labor as well. So that's something definitely to be aware of. If you're not looking for a contract role, you might have to search a bit longer and wait a bit longer to find something. And a lot of these roles, they could potentially be contract turning into permanent, but there's plenty of companies who will just run a contract role for several years. And even the first job I got here was a Western company, but it was a contract role for about a year and a half before I potentially had the option to go permanent. So if that's not something that you're interested in, that's something to be aware of as well, because there is a large number of roles that are contract based versus permanent here.
Now, for that, a chunk of the reason over here is for benefits, right? Like that's why a lot of people, that's why they'll rather prefer the FTE. They immediately start getting benefits. They immediately start getting blah. They don't have to work through potentially whatever benefits are offered, if any are offered, through the consulting staffing firm. I imagine that is probably not the same type of problems over there, just because of the more universal health care, right?
Yeah, some of those benefits you basically get by default. Like, you have to have health insurance. That's not a choice here.
Okay.
There is, like, from what I've seen, that's always been a cost-saving argument here as to why contracting roles are a thing. And also, I think there is an aspect of it as well that in Japan, it's very, very difficult to get fired, for example. Like the labor rights and the labor protection laws are extremely, extremely strong here. So you like it is. I'm not gonna say impossible, but is extremely, extremely difficult to just get fired. So generally, if people are looking to get rid of people, what they will do is they will just, quite frankly, they will keep making your job worse until you quit on your own, versus trying to just terminate you. Yeah.
So what I'm hearing is you and I need to get into a company over there and get them to change their stance on how quickly they fire people.
I mean, you could say we had some practice doing that. We've written policies. One of my proudest achievements. But yeah, it's something to be aware of on that front. If you're somebody who does worry about job security, because keep in mind as well, if you are working in Japan, you need a working visa, and that visa is tied to your employer, which means if you don't have a job, that clock starts ticking. You have about 3 months to find something else, or you have to basically leave. So if you have a contract role, that basically means you know that at a certain point that contract might run out, and whether they renew or not tends to then become a really big deal because it's tied to your ability to stay here unless you have something like a more long-term or permanent visa. So that's another consideration to have when thinking about the stuff that maybe you don't have to, it's not something you're having to think about right now. So moving forward, I want to talk a little bit about some of the differences in the market kind of versus the rest of the world that we didn't cover in terms of like what types. So okay, you decided you still want to do this, so what kind of roles are you looking at? What are the salaries and requirements? So one thing here that I think is really been the case for a long time is the types of roles you're seeing. It's not nearly as segmented or like a dedicated role. It's a lot of, we want one person to do a lot of different things. Like a lot of companies will have like, okay, the security person is the security person doing everything. There's no IR versus SOC versus managing the firewalls versus this versus that. Like a lot of the times that is just the security role. So you're kind of basically having to do a lot of those roles at once. It's not always the case. There is some cases where those are separated out, but I feel like it's still not quite the same thing as it is, in a lot of companies in the States where you can say like, no, my job is, an IR, or let's say I'm a security engineer. I work on security tools. Like that's really not the case here very often. And I think that partially comes from the fact that they just don't necessarily understand what is the scope of those roles and how much work it really is required to be doing that. So they just think, hey, no, this is something we can just get one person to do.
I've seen a change, like a fluctuation in that, where over here it's and just generally in the States, the things that I've been seeing has been over like 2015, 2016 range that will keep popping up. But around that time, we did see a lot of pretty focused positions start getting tossed out there. And a lot of the bigger companies, I mean, even now, may be looking specifically at just the position I just got in, which is focused on security automation, because the folks over here are wonderful. There's not a whole lot of that, and it's just starting to come out of like, okay, security automation, which prior to it would just be security engineering, and security engineering could mean literally anything. we know a few people who moved over into just like being devoted to antivirus, devoted with like antivirus deployment and stuff like that. But I'm actually starting to just see what you're saying come back into the fold, where teams are starting to bring on MSPs more, and as they bring on more of the MSPs, they're trying to tell their security people like, oh, by the way, they're going to be handling the alerts, but now you're also going to be doing on top of the security engineering any kind of escalations from them. And it's like that's a step backwards to where we were, and to us understanding why we needed those separated in the first place. So I am seeing a little bit of a downtrend from where I was hoping things would keep moving towards. But that is more of those mid-sized companies where they are still trying to make sure that there's a justification for the cost of those security teams. So like it's hard from their perspective, right? Like it's hard to say we need focused people on all of these different aspects of things and keep it going the same way, and that cost against that company is always going to keep increasing unless you remove people and keep bringing new blood in. So there's I think there's a lot of managerial things that need to be talked about at some point about that.
Yeah, I think here, there's cases when obviously, that there's going to be the need to wear multiple hats, so to speak. But I told you of an example even from as recently as last week, where it's a new company, but it's a new company backed by a very large company. And the title of it was Incident Response Engineer, but the description was, okay, well, you're the guy doing the EDR stuff, you're doing the incident response, you're doing the SOC escalation, you're doing partially hiring, you're doing the SIEM engineering, you're doing the architecting, you're doing SOAR and automation, and that was all as like, oh, and also TI. So I just named like 8 different things that are all part of one role. That's an impossible task. Yeah. It's nice to want things is really all I can say to places like that. Like, sure. If you can find that person, more power to you, but good luck. And I think it's just, the excuse that you hear is going to be like, well, we're new, we don't have the people, etc. And again, that's, in some circumstances, I get that. If you're a startup, you don't have a budget or whatever. But it also shows to me just a lack of understanding of, either what the scope is or just the fact that, well, I don't want to pay 6 people to do these different jobs that I can hopefully just find one person and overwork him. So there's a lot of that. I mean, the flip side of that is to just illustrate that this is not like a new or small company mentality. I had a very large financial services company that I interviewed with, and the role that they gave me when I read it was kind of the same thing. It was like, okay, so you're going to be the point of contact for all things security in this part of the world. You are going to be doing incident response for 3 days out of your week. For 2 days out of your week, you're going to be a project manager dealing with project management, like security project management tasks. Oh, and on top of that, if there's like audit and compliance stuff, you're going to also do that along with the any other risk things. And when I talked to them about it and talked to the recruiter specifically, my reply was literally like, "Are you going to hire anybody else to help with this? Because this is a team of people you just described." And I basically never got a reply back. So, and this is a company that has a lot of money. But even they, you see them trying to do things like that. So be aware of that. You're going to see a lot of that here. Which it does also go, I'll tie that into salaries very briefly. And John can speak to this as well, but part of the problem is, again, like we mentioned, they want all of these things. And on top of that, they want all of these things plus Japanese fluency, usually, or at least business level Japanese, which, for those who are not aware, business Japanese, known as Keigo essentially, is a whole separate grammar, whole separate vocabulary, very, very specific usage depending on whether you're talking to the person that's quote unquote, more senior than you, less senior than you, your boss, your, department boss, your company boss, your whoever's. It is a separate language in itself that you have to learn just to communicate at work. So that is not a small consideration, and that is a very big barrier to entry to a lot of positions in Japan, because even in my case, I've been here 6 years almost, and I don't have a good grasp on Keigo, because it's the only time you'll get exposure to it is in a work environment. So the only way you'll ever learn it is by working and essentially just being in that, and being in a very Japanese company that's very strict about those types of things. But I also have friends who have been here just as long as I have working for Japanese companies, and they still struggle with it. So you're basically saying, I want this person with this very high technical level of skills that's going to wear a number of different hats, but I also want them to have essentially, nearly fluent level Japanese. So you're stacking a lot of requirements.
One thing I'll add there, based on what I've seen as a more junior person, is that there seems to be a counterintuitive inverse relationship between the experience requirements and the Japanese requirements, meaning if you're applying for senior level roles, they're actually more likely to be forgiving of the language requirements. Whereas if you're applying for junior level roles, particularly anything related to security, functioning similar to a SOC, you're going to be expected to be dealing with clients, with internal staff or stakeholders directly in Japanese. And it could potentially be a very important manager within the company. It could be an important client. And so they want to see that you have a high enough level of Japanese that you're not going to embarrass the company, right, by fumbling or saying something you're not supposed to. I've had interviews for SOC type roles where that was basically the first question, right? They didn't waste any time asking, where I'm from, what my background is. They get straight to the point, can you speak Japanese? So, like Alan's saying, it's a whole different language, right? He and I are both at a good, comfortable conversational level. I think his is probably better than he's letting on, and closer to the business level than mine, certainly. And that's enough for day-to-day life. It's enough to talk to your coworkers in Japanese at a casual level. It's not enough to be able to communicate with customers or clients at the level that's expected. I will add, if you have that ability, then you will get a job. Doesn't matter, it's irrespective of your experience level. You could show up with, I think you would need a degree to get the visa sponsored, but you don't need to know anything about IT. If you can speak at that level, right, as long as you can demonstrate some interest and you have good English to communicate, on the other side of the spectrum, you'll have a job. I mean, recruiters have basically told me as much, but that is really, at the junior level, that is the barrier, is the Japanese ability.
Is this what exactly, do you have any specific examples as to the difference between the business level or not? Like for us, the most it would be is calling someone Mr. or Mrs. or Miss in comparison to using their first name, or in comparison to using their last name, or something of that sort. Is there a specific reference that you can provide to explain that?
I'll go ahead and take this, Alan, if you don't mind. I actually do have one.
Yeah, go for it.
Off the top of my head. So, like Alan was saying, there's a different vocabulary. Now, this may seem like something you would encounter in English as well, and to some extent that's true. But as an example, so if you want someone to take a look at something casually, you would say, mite kudasai, right? So mite is the verb for look, to look. kudasai is a polite way that means please. You would not say that in a business setting. You would have to say something along the lines of, I don't even know if you could say kudasai, Alan. You have to correct me on this. But the verb would be goran ni, right? Goran is a very, very formalized way of saying, please take a look. It would probably be the English equivalent of saying, if I could call your attention to this, right? If I could call your attention here. I think the key difference is that in English, if you're not a native speaker and you're giving a presentation and you ask someone, could you please look here, nobody's likely to get offended by that. But I think in Japanese business culture, if you were to mix those up and say, please mite kudasai, that's going to be seen as a little bit, people might take offense to it. It's far too casual. And I think there's less kind of leeway for that here. And I've heard examples of people with very good Japanese, usually not Westerners, usually people from other Asian countries who came in with a very high level of, with a very significant advantage in learning Japanese. I've heard examples of, companies that just said, we're not comfortable communicating with this person because we don't feel that their Japanese is at the level that we want.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's a different, on top of it just being different words, like even grammar structures will change. So it really does become its own thing. And this is, and let's not, I do want to say, this is not something that's just difficult for foreigners. Like, this is difficult for Japanese people. Like, this is something that they basically learn from a very early age. Even they have issues with doing this consistently. And there's always that. Now imagine a situation that is not uncommon where, for example, you're around the group of people and some of those people are your juniors and some of them are your seniors. You're having to basically switch in the same conversation back and forth between less polite and very polite depending on who you are addressing in the same group. So yeah,
my total exposure to things would come around to a lot of conversation about tentacle monsters, and I imagine that is probably not something that can be
you could take that offline. Maybe you could have a discussion with them about that in an izakaya after the meeting.
Yeah, after you had some drinks. Which actually, interesting thing there. So really quickly to touch on, if you're working, one thing that maybe you might have not known about working for a company that's operating like a Japanese company is there's this concept of nomikai, which is essentially drinking parties, quote unquote. And that's, you think, okay, well, if I go drink with my coworkers, that's something I choose to do, right? In Japan, less so. A nomikai basically can just be, okay, your boss decided I want to go and drink after work. He'll invite you. For the most part, you don't have the option of saying no. So if your boss... so if your boss just wants to go drink and they want to do that 3 times a week, you kind of just go and do it. And if you're not an alcoholic, I do like to be a social drinker, but I like to drink when I want to drink, not when somebody tells me to drink. This is something I actually ask about. If a company has that type of culture, or it's a Japanese company, like, no, are your nomikais, is that something that's mandatory? Like, do you actually do that on a regular basis? If it's something that's like once every few months, or like we do it around Christmas or around a major holiday, okay, cool, that's fine. But I know people who have had to do this every week, sometimes more than once a week. And it's a matter of you finish work, you go drink until like midnight and last train, and then you have to come back to work the next day at like 6.
Did they have to pour the boss's drinks? Because I know that entry-level Japanese people are expected to pour the boss's drinks for him.
Yep. Yeah. That's
pour?
Yeah, as in like you don't pour your own drink usually, especially like for like a senior person. You, as the junior, will pour their drinks for them. Like there's there's a custom almost like how these things operate. Like that's another aspect of it. Like it becomes a work function. Like it doesn't become just, hey, let's go, we're off work, we're just gonna drink. Like you're still kind of being held to certain standards, like cultural standards about how to behave. Like it is an extension of your work to do that. So
I think it is slightly more forgiving for foreigners, at least for Westerners. I think there's a little bit more leeway based on what I hear from people who have worked in more domestic-minded companies. But at the same time, Al and I have a mutual
case by case
acquaintance,
basis.
yeah, who's had to do that. He's working in a pretty domestic company. I think it's not quite as bad, but it's still, there's probably going to be some pressure. Like if you choose not to participate, you might start to feel like you're a little bit outside of the club, right? Like you're not really a team player.
yeah, exactly. So, those are all things you might not have really thought about that all of a sudden become a consideration when doing that.
I just didn't know I was going to need waiter experience. So
Yeah, well, now you know.
I-
But to touch very briefly on salaries as well, since we're kind of on that topic, this is something that, as I said earlier, I had to take a significant pay cut to the tune of about 40% with my first job compared to what I was making in the U.S. Full disclosure, in the U.S., I was probably making more than maybe it was the average at the time, but I had to adjust down significantly to find work in Japan. And salaries are still here. They're quite a bit lower, even in our industry, but most of IT industries when compared to Europe and the rest of the world, America especially. So be ready for that as well. Like along with all of these extra requirements, you might not get the salary that you think maybe you should, or you can get somewhere else. So think about, what is your reason for coming here, and if that's a compromise you're willing to make. Because if it's purely a conversation about, who's going to pay me the most, it's not going to be here. Like that's just, I feel like in some cases it's getting better, but most of the time places that pay well tend to be the Western companies that just have a presence in Japan. But the more domestic you get, the lower it tends to be. So, you do your research and figure out whether, what you're willing to what degree you're willing to compromise.
I think in general, just that's going to be a really weird situation over the next 5 years. Not even just from Japan, but for this whole remote work stuff has caused people who are currently in the 200s to 300s that are like, oh, I want to move somewhere where things are more affordable, and companies are going like, no, you can't do that. And then there's this huge friction of company trying to say like, hey, we should only have to pay you X for this Y skill, while those people are saying like, no, you were paying me for the skill in the first place, so you should still pay me that much money. It doesn't matter where I live. And then you have folks like over here, Arizona, which has been lower for some time, quite some time. I mean, I know people who are getting well into those six figures more than what I'm making, as an example. And in the fact of what they're doing, it's the same. So it becomes a question of when people move based off of where they are, is that really what matters? Is it really just the skill and how it gets represented? Are we going to see an adjustment across the whole entire security industry, the field itself, either higher or lower? I'm not saying which one's right. I don't really care. I'm just really interested to know what's going to happen to that bubble.
I think that becomes even weirder of a conversation when you start opening up to remote, because how much of a headache are you creating for your hiring manager? Because now you're having to say, okay, we have 1,000 people applying, we shortlisted 50, and they all live in different places. okay, so if it's this person, we give it this much because we have to adjust it based on where he's living versus this person.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like that becomes very difficult to manage, and also at the end of the day, I, I'm sure there's people arguing both ways, but to me, you're you're being paid for a skill that you're bringing. You're not. Obviously, they might have to adjust if you live somewhere that is astronomically high, like San Francisco or the DC area. Cost of living obviously becomes a consideration, but at the end of the day, you're paying me because I have a skill set that you need.
Yeah.
So to me, it's one of those things that shouldn't be as much of a it shouldn't be as much of an adjustment. Obviously, again, you can't pay somebody living in San Francisco $40,000 a year and expect them to be able to have a living wage. But
I just I'm waiting for somebody to be standing like on the corner in San Francisco with like a sign that just says, "Help! I'm homeless. I only have a job paying me $100,000 a year." Like that, I would not be surprised for that to be like a legitimate thing that can happen.
I mean, if the cost of living keeps going up, I mean, geez, like people say Tokyo is expensive, but like it's not. Tokyo expensive like relative to the rest of Japan, but you compare it to like London or San Francisco or even the DC area or like anywhere in Switzerland or any of those major cities across Europe, like Tokyo is cheap. Like maybe you don't get as much space, but like relatively in terms of the dollar amount, like I don't have to pay $3,000 a month for rent for a shoe closet if I don't want to. I can find something for significantly less than that.
Right.
Where in San Francisco, you to a large degree kind of can't.
Yeah.
All right, so the last thing I want to talk about here is we covered a little bit. It's just the work expectations, so things like work-life balance, the workload, the work culture. We talked a little bit about with some of the things like the nomikai and things like that. Work-life balance, I think, is a big one because whether you live in Japan or not, I'm sure you heard stories about the stereotype of the Japanese salaryman and working all the time, all day every day, and basically just overwork as a culture. So if you're coming from an environment where work-life balance is very important to you, be aware that that's something that you need to be discussing up front. You can't make assumptions that it exists here. There is a lot of cases, like I said before, based on the job roles, you're expected to do a lot of different things for that should have been maybe a team of people. So obviously that's going to take time. And there's a lot of companies as well that have a kind of in your contract, there's a built-in expectation of overtime. How much overtime is dependent on the company. Some of the worst companies, like John mentioned, is, they can go up, 100 hours or more a month in terms of overtime. Some, they might be less than that. So, for example, an hour a day might be considered not so bad. But if you're somebody that says, no, I don't want overtime and I want to be able to finish, start at 9, finish at 6, and that's it, that might be something harder to find. And, be aware of that. And I know that there's, especially in places like San Francisco, for example, there's the whole idea of the hustle culture and even the overwork idea being cool, becoming more of a thing even there. So, yeah, it's be aware that that is very much a thing here. There is places where you can find that, where they do take that stuff very seriously. I am in my current company for that reason now. They're very, very good on that. But it is something you have to explicitly ask and confirm. Don't assume it'll just exist.
I can kind of reinforce that hustle culture and stuff. It does exist. It's definitely there, but I will say that it's starting to have that downward trend. I have heard it quite a lot in interviews, at least over the past 6 months, of folks stating like, "Oh yeah, we're this new startup. We definitely need someone to just jump in and wear a bunch of different hats, blah blah blah, all that stuff." But the fact of the matter is that what I've seen over the past few years is, as soon as folks start getting ideas on Twitter and start throwing ideas out there, they swell into this giant tornado of things, and companies tend to change after there's enough traction. And one of those things are people specifically stating, like, stop with overtime, just like overtime shouldn't exist, and everything. I am one of those people that I should not in any way, shape, or form be the one telling other people not to work overtime, because I tend to love what I do and do it all the time. But like that, I in no way, shape, or form expect that from anyone else. I just find I have the means to find time. I don't have kids, as an example. Like my kids are my dogs and my cat. So from the perspective of like well, should I just go play games? Then the other side of me is like, yeah, but I can create like 2 pieces of automation in the time that I would be spending like doing a raid and WoW. There's those things that happen in my head that I don't think are right. Like I don't know if it's just I've kind of put myself in this position to feel like I need to do that to justify. I've that imposter syndrome almost esque type of ideology, where it's just like, hey, I need to do this to prove it to myself, or I need to do this to prove it to my team, to show that they didn't make a poor choice by keeping me around, after all the completely stupid and awful jokes I've made. But from the perspective of like, what am I seeing? Definitely Twitter and LinkedIn are kind of going crazy with a lot more of the standardized normal working days. I mean, even less so. Like some folks are starting to try and focus on the 32-hour work week instead of the 40-hour work week and stuff.
Yeah, and that's, I think the difference though is like you mentioned how you work, and I think if you're voluntarily doing that, that's one thing. I think when there's the expectation of that and potentially negative consequences if you don't, I think that's a very different conversation. Obviously, we work in incident response. There's always an expectation that, hey, at any given time, if there's an incident, you might have to work overtime. It comes with being in this industry, and that part of it is okay, but one thing, for example, that's Japan specific, overtime can just be a thing of, hey, my manager is busy and they're working, and one of these cultural things is you, as somebody that's part of that team, should never leave before your manager does. Which means if they're busy and you're not, you're just going to hang around and wait until they leave so you can leave at the same time. You might not even be working, you might not necessarily be productive, but you're just going to hang around, because if you're somebody who leaves early, it reflects poorly on you. And like John said earlier, maybe that's not always the case. If you're a foreigner, you get a free pass. However, keep in mind that free pass just means maybe you might not have direct negative consequences, but also keep in mind that you already stand out in Japan as a non-Japanese person. So doing more things to make yourself stand out more for potentially what they see as wrong reasons, it is going to potentially isolate you further. So there is consequences. There may be just not the ones you think about.
And this is also a platform to try and help bring those problems to light. So even if even if some things are relaxed on the foreigner side, the truth behind it is we need to let people have lives, no matter where they are. Because I mean, I know you've mentioned before that you know folks who have been sick because of it. So
yeah, that's it's not an uncommon occurrence, but like that's another one of those cultural things that people here, they will work themselves to the point of hospitalization, and sometimes worse. I will say that generally there is companies with a bad reputation who have a reputation for that, and they don't have a good reputation in Japan either, but they still continue to get away with that because generally the fines and the government response is not very strong. Like it equates to a slap on the wrist. So why would they change at that point? So what I will say is for somebody again who might have like if you're somebody that gets sick easily for whatever reason because you're exerting yourself physically too much, this is something you need to consider. Um, and it is something that you need to know what you're willing to expect, what you're willing to accept, and whether that's worth it for you alongside on top of the language requirement, on top of the culture requirement and expectations. You cannot, the one thing I will say, and the one thing I see here a lot is people who complain about living here the most are the people who tend to kind of try to fight against adapting to the culture at all. And I don't mean like, no, you take on all of these mannerisms and things, expectations. I mean like, you can't come to Japan and expect it to just be your home country in a new location. Like, to some degree, you have to adapt. You have to be willing to adapt. And if you're not, you're going to be miserable here.
Hmm.
One disclaimer I think we should add, and I think we've gotten this point across, but maybe for people who are not as familiar with the subject, they might get the wrong impression. I mean, the problems we're talking about are very real in Japan generally. I think things like staying in the office till the boss goes home, I think that's much, much, much more likely in a more traditional domestic company. I mean, I didn't see that in my previous company. There was overtime, not so much for me. Other team members did have overtime that I thought was questionable, but it was more about maybe priorities that could have been handled differently. It wasn't so much about staying till the boss went home. I think maybe that does happen to some extent in more international companies, but not necessarily something is going to be your chief concern if you get a job in a more international outfit. So that stuff I think could vary a lot depending on what kind of job you get and where. But certainly if you're talking about Japan and Japanese work culture more generally, not just looking at a handful of international companies, you might be looking for a security engineering job or SOC job. I mean, yeah, those are definitely pretty prevalent problems.
Yeah, I mean, basically the thing is be aware that those things exist. We're not sitting here telling you every company is like that or no company is like that, but we're just telling you about these things do exist. And even if it's a Western company, it could be a Western company that's run in a very Japanese way. It could be a Japanese company that's run in a more Western way. Like there's various permutations, but the whole idea here is pay attention to that stuff. Research either how the company operates in Japan specifically, because the Japanese branch might operate very differently than maybe the American or the European one. So those are all things you maybe want to consider. Whether you'll run into all of these things we mentioned, that's again specific to your situation and the company you're looking at. But what I don't want to do is have people, think like I've decided to do this and then come here and have that kind of culture shock essentially, and then think like, oh God, I made a mistake. Like, know what you're getting into because it is a big move. Like, I've been here 6 years, and with all of this stuff, I still very much love my life here. But I've carved out, a situation where I can work for a company that lets me, for the most part, meet all of these requirements that I have in terms of work-life balance, in terms of culture, in terms of how they operate, so that I can kind of get the best of both worlds, so to speak, at least for what my priorities tend to be. So know what yours are as well, and if that's something you can get, and if that's something you can find, then awesome. But be aware that maybe some of these things we mentioned are not things you might have thought about, and maybe there's something you should think about if you're somebody thinking about making this type of move. All right. So I think we can go ahead and end on that note. If there's any questions or you guys want to clarify on anything that we just covered.
I mean, I just want to echo what you said, because I feel like since we're focusing specifically on work culture here and problems that foreigners might run into, it might be painting a somewhat bleak picture. And I just want to reiterate as well, I quite like living in Japan. It's very comfortable, very safe, and just generally easy place to live, right? I think when you're trying to build out your life professionally here, the problems we discussed are things you have to navigate. I think if you can work those things out, it's an excellent place to live. I really am quite happy living here. But like you said as well, people do come here not necessarily knowing what they're getting into, and that's why it's important to shed a light on some of those concerns. I think really the advice you gave at the outset was very sound, and that just is essentially come here with as much information and as much security as you can. If you can get a transfer internally within your company, then that's an excellent way to try and transition to Japan, because you'll have a better idea of what you're getting into and you'll have more security in that job. But, I just want to make it clear to anybody listening, Japan really is a great place to live, right? But like you were saying, Alan, you need to know exactly what you're getting into.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, do your research. It's a big move. It's a big step. Make sure you're prepared. All right, so we'll leave that there for now, and let's move out to our shout out to the community section. And this week, I want to call out Ed Scotus. He is another SANS instructor, and you can find him on Twitter at twitter.com/EDSKOUDIS. And Ed Scotus is he's the first SANS instructor I've actually had, and I took my GCIH with him. He's just an absolutely amazing teacher. Like, he's somebody who has such a good grasp on security, but more importantly on how to teach it. Like, he's super fun to listen to. He has interesting anecdotes, interesting stories. Like, he's a very good way of relating his experiences to the topics that he's trying to teach you in a way that sticks around as a result. And it's just like I feel like knowing something, knowing how to do something, and knowing how to teach something are very different skill sets. And making something very complex, very easy to understand, and relatable, I think it's a very difficult skill, and it's not a skill a lot of people have. And that GCIH course was still my favorite course. I mean, he teaches some other courses as well. I think he was teaching the GPEN at one point. I don't know if he still does, but I pretty much will suggest any class with him. And if you follow him on Twitter, he speaks on podcasts a lot. He does a lot of cool stuff. So yeah, give him a follow and check out, if you're somebody considering a SANS course, check out the stuff that he does. Like, I really think that you're gonna enjoy his content. And if I can, we keep mentioning people like John Strand, but John Strand, Rob Lee, Ed Scotus, like, there's amazing folks. So
Ryan Chapman.
Yeah, of course. He's a new instructor. I haven't taken his course, but I have taken some of his other courses, like the Pluralsight course. And yeah, that's probably why Ryan is, kind of going towards the SANS thing, is because he has that type of mentality. He loves to teach. Yeah. So that's probably why he's going to be very good as a SANS instructor, is because he has that similar, shares some of those similar personality traits with people like Ed and with people like John. So yeah, all good people to follow. And if you're listening, just to be sure, I know we recommend a lot of SANS people, but we're by no means sponsored by any of these people or anything like that. So this is just purely us going, no, we had really good experiences with these people. They do really cool work, so check them out.
You don't have video on, so they can't see all the free SANS merch you guys are wearing right now.
Yeah, the big banner we have in the background. No, I left a previous job because I didn't want to have to take a SANS certification. So I definitely am not paid by SANS.
You're opposite. You owe them money.
But yeah, exactly. But I do love them, so I will say that.
All right. So for the tool recommendation, we covered. So we're gonna covering another distribution essentially. We covered Tsurugi previously, which is a Linux forensics-based distribution and a live response toolkit as well. This week we're covering Flare VM, which is the reversing / forensics virtual machine maintained by the folks at FireEye. It is a Windows-based distribution, but it pretty much will have everything you need to get started with some basic, host network forensics, some basic reverse engineering. I think all the tools on there are open source tools. So yeah, I know it's a little bit weird. Like it's not a tool recommendation; it's a suite of tools. But this stuff is really good. It's maintained pretty regularly and updated regularly. And even as a free bonus, for those of you who are going through the Practical Malware Analysis book, they actually include the labs for that book on the distribution. So extra incentive to go and take those.
Yeah, and if you're in a situation like there's actually quite a few companies where they kind of put themselves in a spot where they have to predefine the things that they can or can't use. So in this specific case, you'd be able to say, like, look, we utilize Flare VM for all of our reverse engineering, as an example, and we tend to not deviate. Or if you have to pass something out to brand new analysts, a large set of a new team, and instead of letting them just get like a VM and have to kind of go on a whim and download a bunch of things, this is a great way to just say, here you go. This literally can have anything and everything that you might possibly need for X, Y, or Z, and you'll be able to do great things. One of our old managers used to say that, go forth, do great things, and that will be in my head forever. But one of the really neat things about this is that they have a link where you can just download a Windows VM, whether it be VirtualBox, what was it, VBox, I saw VMware, what else do we have, Hyper-V or Parallels. Wow, they even got Parallels on here, cool. But if you have any of those, you just download it and then you run an install PowerShell script. It tells you, steps you through how to get it all rolling and how to make sure that it rolls through. But for the most part, this is a great way to spin something up very, very quickly instead of having to have meetings and conversations about what tools, what packages do we actually want, and how does it help us. You can kind of point to, well, this company that does this for a living, they're kind of well known. They have this. They show this. It's kind of like saying Remnux. So yeah, whatever. Yeah, exactly. And super easy to get started with. Like, it is literally just run a couple of commands and the script will basically do everything else for you. So yeah, check it out. All right, so the last piece of business here, we just want to go ahead and share some of our media links and things like that. So yeah, you can find us on twitter.com/malwarewolf, youtube.com/malwarewolf, malwarewolf.com, and for the podcast, anchor.fm/malwarewolf. So please follow, subscribe, give us a listen, and if you like what we do and want to support us, you can do that through the listener support on the Anchor FM page or through our website as well, through the Buy Me a Coffee. And but if you just want to spread the word and get some other people to listen as well, that's great. So yeah, thank you all for doing that, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Oh, we're not done yet, Alan.
No wrestling, damn it.
You
No.
tried.
No.
But here it goes. We've got the one and only CM Punk is now rumored to come back to come to AEW. and that was earlier this morning. This is one of those, like, I don't care if this is a rumor. I'm just like extremely excited at the idea. When the AEW first came up and was getting pushed out, there was a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of folks saying, "Oh yeah, CM Punk's for sure going to be one of those debut people," but he was actively saying and telling people, like, "No, we've barely had conversations, and there's nothing there. I don't know what you're talking about." But he's now fueled speculation. One of the next major pay-per-views is going to be in his hometown. It's going to be in Chicago. If he debuts there, the world is going to explode in just how much joy and awesome happens. Like, I can't even imagine how crazy that crowd would go if all of this comes true. And on top of all of that, the thing that's confirmed is previously known as Daniel Bryan, Bryan Danielson. He's been 100% quote unquote confirmed to come to AEW. So now not only are we potentially getting CM Punk back into wrestling, we're also getting Daniel Bryan, who they wrestled once. I think it was at a WrestleMania, and it was amazing. And being able to bring that into with all this like young blood in the AEW, I'm very giddy right now.
Okay, folks. So I guess the last thing I will say is, if you want to go on Twitter and tell Jason that you don't want to hear about wrestling at the end of our podcast, you can do that as well.
Nope.
All right. So we'll talk to you in a few weeks.
Nope.
Bye-bye.
Bye.